Today we're going to be talking about the presidencies of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, which are, broadly speaking, the 1990s. So starting with George H.W. Bush, he was Ronald Reagan's vice president during his 8 years in the Oval Office, and running on Reagan's high popularity, high approval rating. In 1988, Bush ran as the Republican nominee for president, and he won. So this was due mostly to Reagan's popularity, due to Reagan's endorsement. Also the fact that after 8 years of the Reagan presidency, the economy was very good, and Bush had made a commitment to be tough on crime, which had gotten out of control over the decade. Bush won 40 out of 50 states, making this the last landslide in U.S. presidential election history. Every election since then has been very close. Bush's four-year presidency from 1989 to 1993 would be defined largely by the end of the Cold War, victory in the Persian Gulf War, and unfortunately racial tensions in America. So let's start with the end of the Cold War. On November 9th, 1989, the residents of the city of Berlin, which had been divided for decades, marched to the Berlin Wall and demanded passage across the Berlin Wall from the soldiers there. They were not stopped by the Soviet soldiers, and they tore down the Berlin Wall piece by piece with axes and sledgehammers. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Soviet leader at the time, he could have ordered the communist troops at the wall to shoot the crowd of people, but he didn't. Now, undoubtedly, that is what some of his predecessors would have done, but he did not. And this wise decision marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Now, something that was very important is the fact that President Bush did not gloat, but he took the victory very calmly, and this allowed Russia to lose the Cold War with dignity and establish a new positive relationship with America and with the rest of the free world. Then in 1990, Germany reunified as one non-communist country for the first time since the beginning of the Cold War. Now, from 1989 to 1991, communist regimes fell all across Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe had been the communist bloc throughout the 45 years of the Cold War. And in this 2-year period from 1989 to 91, you have one nation after another abandoning communism, those regimes falling and being replaced with a freer system. From Poland to Czechoslovakia to Romania to Hungary, all of these nations removed the shackles of communism in this 2-year period. So the victory that people like Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II and Margaret Thatcher, and even going back to people like Richard Nixon, and so many others had worked towards for so long, was finally coming, and it was coming much faster than people thought that it would. Then in 1991, after it became clear that the Soviet Union had become bankrupt, it was quickly losing its influence on the world, Gorbachev resigned as the General Secretary of the USSR. He then declared that there would not be another. And for this, Gorbachev received the Nobel Peace Prize, because in doing so, he officially ended the Cold War. Because on December 26, 1991, after Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, the Soviet Union no longer existed. It ceased to exist. It was dissolved. It was broken up into 15 different independent countries, and communism was replaced by other forms of government in all of these former Soviet states. And the very pro-American leader, Boris Yeltsin, became the new president of Russia, and Russia started to have a very positive relationship with the U.S. and with the free world. Its economy began to boom, and it was a completely transformed place. Now, this liberated hundreds of millions of people from communist oppression. The gulags were emptied out, and this officially ended the Cold War after 45 long years. But while communism was dead in Europe, unfortunately, it was still very much alive in Asia and killing people there. After Mao Zedong's death in 1976, the future of China was very much unclear. It had started to open up to trade and foreign influence starting in 1972 with Richard Nixon's visit there and meeting with Mao. Now, most Chinese people wanted China to become a republic again. They wanted it to become socially free and economically free market. Well, Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China for a time, after Mao, had made strides in economic freedom. He had lifted millions of Chinese people out of poverty through a shift from socialism to capitalism. However, social freedoms continued to be denied. So while people had economic freedoms, they did not have, freedom of worship, right to vote, freedom of speech, anything like that. And because of that, in 1989, there was a student-led protest march in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And this march was a demonstration over the lack of political freedom and the lack of societal progress that had occurred in China since Mao's death. But this protest turned violent when Chinese troops were sent in to break up the protest march. Chinese troops armed with tanks and rifles, they went into the crowd and killed nearly 1,000 unarmed civilians in the streets. Blood ran the streets of Tiananmen Square that day. And then immediately afterwards, the Chinese Communist Party denied that it had ever happened. And even to this day, the CCP denies that the Tiananmen Square massacre ever took place. But this showed that while communism was dead in Europe, it was still very much alive and killing people elsewhere in the world. Then in August of 1990, you have another threat emerging, that one in the Middle East. This is when Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded the small country of Kuwait and annexed it under their control in order to acquire their oil. Well, the U.S. responded to this aggression by leading a coalition of 35 different nations to invade Kuwait and push the Iraqis out. We said we don't want to appease Saddam Hussein in the same way that we appeased Hitler, because then he may never be satisfied and we could have another tyrant and world war on our hands. So this military conflict became known as the Persian Gulf War, sometimes simply called the Gulf War. There were two phases of this war. There was Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. Now, Desert Shield was the preliminary build-up phase to build up troops and defense across the Kuwaiti border in Saudi Arabia, and then Desert Storm was the combat mission. Now, this took only about 6 weeks to accomplish. In about 6 weeks, the U.S. was able to push the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. This very fast and effective military operation resulted in 292 American deaths and approximately 30,000 Iraqi deaths. Very fast, very decisive victory. This secured America's place as the world's only superpower, because now you had the Soviet Union collapsed and America winning a war and liberating a nation, Kuwait, and so it really solidified our place as the world's sole superpower. Once the U.S. pushed Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis out of Kuwait, Bush then chose not to extend the fighting into Iraq. He proclaimed, the mission to be accomplished and then withdrew. He said, we're going to let the Iraqis retreat with honor, and we're not going to invade Iraq in order to depose Saddam Hussein. Now, the leaders of the U.S. during the Persian Gulf War were, of course, President George H.W. Bush. This fast and decisive victory in the Persian Gulf War is seen as his greatest accomplishment while in office. And then the general who led the U.S. forces in Kuwait was Norman Schwarzkopf. His nickname was Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. And then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was Colin Powell, and they made most of the military decisions. Another important part of George H.W. Bush's presidency was the appointment of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Now, back in 1967, Thurgood Marshall was nominated by Lyndon Johnson to be the first black Supreme Court justice, and he served on the bench for more than 20 years. Before serving as a Supreme Court justice, Thurgood Marshall was a lawyer. He was actually the one who argued the famous case Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall served until 1991, and then he chose to retire. Then the sitting president, George H.W. Bush, nominated Clarence Thomas to replace him as the second black Supreme Court justice. However, unlike with Thurgood Marshall, Clarence Thomas was not accepted with open arms by the U.S. Senate. The Senate very much resisted Clarence Thomas's appointment to the Supreme Court, and specifically the Senate Judiciary Committee, who is supposed to ask the nominee questions to see if he or she is qualified for the Supreme Court. they were brutal to Clarence Thomas, and they held televised hearings in order to question Clarence Thomas on his worthiness. Now, the two senators who led the opposition to Clarence Thomas's appointment to the court were Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden. Ted Kennedy, of course, the youngest brother of John F. Kennedy, and Joe Biden, the future president. Now, they disagreed with Clarence Thomas's interpretation of the Constitution. Clarence Thomas was and is an originalist, meaning he wants to interpret the Supreme Court the way the founders intended, whereas Joe Biden and Ted Kennedy and the others who are opposed to him see it more of as a living document, something whose meaning changes over time. And so they didn't want him on the court because they were afraid that he would that he would judge unfavorably towards issues that they cared about. So because they disagreed with him, they did everything they could to prevent him from becoming a justice on the Supreme Court. Now, in the televised hearings, they asked him intensely personal questions. These were not just questions about his professional experience and whether he was, intelligent or qualified enough to be a judge. They were incredibly personal questions. For example, they asked him, "Have you ever watched pornography?" And all of these just incredibly personal questions that are none of their business. They even invited a woman who used to work for Clarence Thomas, who testified that he had sexually harassed her, provided no evidence, but still her testimony was very emotionally powerful to a lot of people who were watching. Now, in response to this, Clarence Thomas responded on television with a speech of his own, and he said that this televised hearing was, quote, a circus. He called it a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who dared to think for themselves. So with this, he was implying that the Democratic Party says they support black people, but they really only support black voices that agree with them, and they try to silence those who don't. Well, the Senate voted, and with a very close vote of 52 to 48, Clarence Thomas was confirmed to the Supreme Court and has served on the court for over 30 years. Another racial incident that took place in the early 90s was the beating of Rodney King. So on March 3rd, 1991, a black man named Rodney King drunkenly led the LA Police Department on a high-speed chase. Now, once he was pulled over, he was then dragged out of the car, he was forced to the ground, and savagely beaten by 4 police officers. 3 of the police officers were white, 1 was black, and then they arrested him. Now, during this beating, he suffered 11 fractures and multiple other injuries, and this was all caught on film. Now, Rodney King then sued the city of LA for damages. He was awarded $3.8 million. However, on April 29, 1992, after the police officers who beat him had been put on trial for assaulting Rodney King, those 4 police officers were acquitted. They were declared not guilty and didn't have any further punishment. And in response to this, you have a 3-day riot breaking out all across Los Angeles, starting in South Central LA, a predominantly black community. There was widespread looting, there was assaults, arson, property damage, and this chaotic violence was captured on live TV via helicopter. In one particularly violent and dramatic moment, you had a truck driver named Reginald Denny who was dragged from his truck by 4 black men who became known as the LA Four, who targeted him because he was white, and they were trying to exact revenge on whites for what happened to Rodney King. They severely beat him. They fractured his skull with a cinder block. But then after this happened, since all of this is on TV, you had 4 other black residents who saw this happening on TV, right down the block from where they lived. Then they rushed to help him. One of them drove him to the hospital, saved his life. He barely survived and suffered brain damage the rest of his life. The most common chant by rioters was "No justice, no peace." In other words, saying that if policemen aren't going to be held responsible for their crimes, then there won't be any peace, and peaceful protest won't do. Now, Rodney King, to his credit, did not condone these riots. He knew that he had been wronged, but he famously said, "Can we all get along?" He said we should only peacefully protest, not loot and riot. Now, in the end, 63 people were murdered during these 3 days of violence. In addition to that, over 2,000 people were injured. 8,000 people were arrested, and you had over $1 billion in property damage. Now, when this took place, of course, you have all of these national discussions occurring over race, and a lot of times the people who get asked to comment are famous people. And there was one popular rapper at the time named Sista Soldier, and in response to the LA riots, she was asked in an interview if the rioters were wise to respond to injustice with violence. And she responded, and I quote, "Yeah, it was wise. If black people kill black people every day, why not have a week and kill white people for a change? White people were well aware of the fact that black people were dying every day in LA under gang violence, so if you're a gang member and you would normally be killing somebody, why not kill a white person?" Now, when this took place, a lot of people were very shocked that such kind of violence would be condoned as revenge, essentially. And there were a lot of people who said, well, we shouldn't tolerate racism from one side to combat racism from the other side. And one person who spoke against such an attitude was the Arkansas governor, Bill Clinton, who was running for president at the time. And he was asked by Jesse Jackson to speak at a conference of his organization called the Rainbow Coalition. And Bill Clinton used this opportunity to call out black racism as well as white racism. And in this speech, he read this excerpt from Sista Soldier's interview, and he said, if you take the words white and black and reverse them, you would think that David Duke is saying that. And David Duke was the leader of the KKK at the time. And so he said, we need to hold each other responsible, but we need to have discussion, we need to have dialogue and hold each other accountable in that way and not react with violence. Well, in 1992, George H.W. Bush ran for re-election, and his opponent, as I said, was Democrat Bill Clinton. Now, America had been very successfully globally during his presidency. However, domestically, the economy had declined and racial divisions had grown. And because of that, a lot of people wanted a change in president. Bill Clinton challenged Bush as the Democratic nominee. One thing that Clinton had going for him was that he was much younger. He was also more charismatic. He was a very well-spoken person. And he also did a much better job in the debates. While Bush appeared distracted, Clinton appeared youthful, decisive, and most of all, compassionate. Now, there was also a third-party candidate who ran in 1992 named Ross Perot, and he received over 1 million votes, most of which probably would have gone to Bush if he had not run. And so all of this combined led to Bill Clinton narrowly defeating President Bush in the 1992 election. Bill Clinton was very popular, especially with African Americans, receiving 94% of the black vote in 1992 and a whopping 99% of the black vote in 1996. He supported legislation to end racial profiling. He also improved business opportunities for minorities, and he supported affirmative action. Now, during his presidency, wages and median household income rose for all demographics, and the poverty rate decreased. The economy did very well during Clinton's 8 years in office. He also created a program called Empowerment Zones, and these were 31 neighborhoods essentially across the country in which job creation was funded in poor communities. And he basically said, instead of just giving money and handouts to people who are poor and suffering, how about we give them job opportunities so they can have a replenishing source of income and also have the skills to learn to take care of themselves. And this was actually the precursor to something that took place in the late 2010s, created by Senator Tim Scott, called Opportunity Zones, that also helped many people get out of poverty. Because of all of his work for the black community, in 2001, the NAACP gave Bill Clinton a Lifetime Achievement Award. Now, one part of the Clinton presidency that was loved by some and hated by others, and has had a controversial past, was a crime bill, the 1994 crime bill. Now, as I said, crime had gotten out of control by the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, the early 90s saw more violent crime than had ever been seen in U.S. history. So in an effort to decrease crime rates, Bill Clinton, along with many people in Congress, worked to pass the 1994 crime bill. So as a part of this crime bill, the first thing it did was it expanded the death penalty. In order to try to decrease violent crime, it expanded the crimes that would be under threat of receiving the death penalty if you were convicted of them. It also created sex offender registries. It provided $9.7 billion for the building of more prisons. It also created the three-strike provision, which meant that if you were caught committing a crime 3 times, and if one of them was a serious violent felony, you were imprisoned for life. They said 3 strikes and you're out. It created mandatory minimums and truth in sentencing laws. A mandatory minimum means if you're convicted of a crime, a judge or a jury has to give you at least a certain number of years in prison. They can't go easier on you if they want to. And then truth in sentencing means that if you are sentenced to serve, let's say, 8 years in prison, you have to serve a majority of that time. You can't be let off super early on good behavior. It also led to 100,000 more police officers on the streets, and it increased penalties for nonviolent drug offenses and, controversially, penalized the possession of some drugs more than others. Now, one big proponent of this crime bill, in fact, one of the people who wrote it, was Senator Joe Biden. He led the movement to pass it, and it was supported and signed by Bill Clinton. It was the largest bipartisan federal crime bill ever passed in America. Both the majority of Republican and Democratic senators and congressmen voted for it, and it was passed. So the big question is, did this work? Well, it did work in decreasing crime, especially in black communities. The crime rate went way down, and it stayed low for a very long time. However, one thing that it did negatively was that it increased mass incarceration, especially among African Americans. So while you have a lot less crime, you also have a lot more people being in prison. One controversial part of this bill is that it made very little distinction between violent crime and drug crimes, and the drug laws were labeled as racist by black leaders like Jesse Jackson. Some other things that Clinton did in 1997, he appointed historian John Hope Franklin to lead One America in the 21st Century, which was the president's initiative on race. And this encouraged racial reconciliation, dialogue to try to help communities discuss racial and ethnic divisions in productive ways. Another thing that took place during the 20th century that tried to be remedied in the Clinton administration was from 1932 to 1972, there was an infamous scientific study that took place known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. And this was something that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, conducted on 400 African Americans who had syphilis. Now, the purpose of the study was to observe the effects of syphilis when untreated. However, by the end of the study, medical advancements meant that it was entirely treatable. So the men who were a part of this study were not informed of the nature of the experiment. They thought that they were getting a cure, but they were also getting a placebo, and they were basically being used as lab rats to see how the disease deteriorated the human body when left untreated. And as a result of this experiment, more than 100 died since they were not given the treatment that they needed. Now, in 1997, President Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the U.S. government to victims of the study, and he called it shameful and racist. Clinton also led efforts to formally recognize black veterans of the Korean War who had been ignored for a very long time. Something else that Clinton did had to do with the topic of homosexuality. In the 1990s, that became a big question, was should the public attitude on homosexual behavior change, or should it remain the same? How should we view it? Well, in 1994, Bill Clinton signed into law something called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now, at this time, openly gay people were not allowed to serve in the military because it was seen that this would, quote, risk the high standards of morale, good order, and discipline in a unit. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell ruled that if you were in the military, you were not allowed to ask a fellow soldier if he or she was gay. And then if you were gay, you had to keep that a secret. So this allowed homosexuals to serve in the military if they were not openly gay or participating in homosexual behavior. And then another law that had to do with this topic in 1996 was called the Defense of Marriage Act, something also signed by President Clinton. And this legally defined marriage for federal purposes as the union between one man and one woman. Now, this still allowed for states to recognize gay marriage if they voted to do so, but it reserved the term spouse and all the tax and legal benefits that went along with it to heterosexual couples only. Now, both of these measures were the law for about 20 years, and then they were repealed under President Obama. Also in 1994, Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and this promoted free trade, but it also made it easy for companies to outsource American jobs to Mexico and Canada, instead of making American companies stay in the U.S. and hire Americans. So the big question was, should we have total free trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, or should we have restrictions to try to benefit the U.S. Instead of letting our jobs go elsewhere? It was later replaced in the year 2020 by Donald Trump with USMCA, which is the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In the 1990s, globally, you have quite a lot of chaos happening, especially in the Middle East. In the 1990s, Somalia descended into anarchy, and the military general Mohammed Farah Aidid took over. And when he took over, you have this massive famine ensuing. And as Aidid ordered his troops to steal and hoard food, the famine became worse and worse. He used hunger as a weapon to control the population. And even the emergency food supplies that were delivered by the UN, his troops would steal that, they would hoard it, and they would shoot anyone who tried to acquire that food to feed themselves or their families. So the U.S. forces went into Somalia in 1993 to try to remove Aidid from power so that the people there could eat. And what ensued was the Battle of Mogadishu in October of 1993. And this was an attack in the city of Mogadishu, Somalia, in which 18 Americans were killed and 72 were wounded. This was depicted famously in the movie Black Hawk Down. And this resulted in the U.S. withdrawing from Somalia, essentially saying, hey, we tried, we got killed, we're not going to risk more American lives getting involved in a crisis in a third world country like that, again, anytime soon. Well, but then, if you fast forward a year from there, you get to another crisis taking place, also in East Africa, in the nation of Rwanda. Rwanda was the site of one of the worst genocides in human history, and it took place from April to June of 1994. During this 2-month period, you have one tribe called the Hutus carrying out a genocide on their rival tribe, the Tutsis. And during these 2 months, the Hutus slaughtered 800,000 people belonging to the Tutsi tribe. And they were killed not with guns, they were killed with machetes. And after this, after the catastrophe of Mogadishu, other countries were very nervous, very hesitant about sending their militaries to unstable African countries because they were afraid of what might happen to their own troops. And because of that, foreign nations like the U.S. and the United Nations itself didn't really do anything to stop the Rwandan genocide until it was too late. Clinton later said that this was the biggest regret of his presidency. Now, in the 1980s, the U.S. had provided arms to Afghanis to fight the Soviets, who had invaded Afghanistan in 1979 and occupied it for the next 10 years. Now, Osama bin Laden, who was a Saudi Arabian radical, moved to Afghanistan in order to fight the Soviets. He acquired U.S. weapons, he formed the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, and then once the Soviets finally left Afghanistan in 1989, bin Laden then turned his sights to terrorizing the only superpower left in the world, the United States. In 1993, Al-Qaeda terrorists carried out their first attack on U.S. soil when they bombed the World Trade Center in New York City, killing 6 people and wounding 1,000. It was actually 7 people, if you count the unborn baby of one of the women who was killed. The bomb was in a truck that was parked by the terrorists beneath the North Tower, and it was intended to bring down both towers. And while this was seen as a fluke event, something we weren't really familiar with, tragically, this was only the beginning of what became the Age of Terrorism. In 1996, Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda declared war on the United States, and the U.S. responded by not declaring war back on them. We didn't really regard al-Qaeda as an urgent threat. We had never declared war on a group before, or an idea, or an action, but only on a nation, and al-Qaeda wasn't a nation. The next year, in 1997, CNN sent a group of correspondents into Afghanistan to interview Osama bin Laden. And there you see him, that's a picture at the bottom of him giving an interview with CNN, his rifle in the background propped up. And in this video, he expressed his view that America is evil. He said America is run by, quote, the Jews, and then he threatened that more attacks were imminent, that more attacks would come and that they would come very soon. Well, this happened the next year in 1998 when al-Qaeda carried out 2 simultaneous bombings of the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. This killed 224 people, and it wounded more than 4,000 people. The U.S. military response was very minimal to this, and al-Qaeda just continued to plot their jihad, which means holy war, holy struggle, against those that they considered to be infidels. Then you have in October of 2000 another terrorist attack on the U.S. The group al-Qaeda bombed the USS Cole, which was an American battleship that was docked off the coast of Yemen, and 17 American soldiers were killed and 39 were wounded in this blast. Essentially, you have a couple of al-Qaeda terrorists with bombs sailing up to this boat and then blowing up their small boat and blowing a hole in the American battleship and killing several American soldiers along the way. And once again, the U.S. did not respond to this military act of war. We did not respond militarily to it. And this just continued to embolden bin Laden and al-Qaeda to attempt a much larger attack 11 months later, on September 11th, 2001. So this is a lesson from history that if you appease a tyrant or a terrorist, they're going to keep pushing the envelope and keep getting bolder and keep getting more and more destructive. So you really have to end it from the very first incursion. Now, in addition to the rise of radical Islamic terrorism, like with al-Qaeda, you also have some domestic terrorism increasing in the 1990s. For example, in 1995, you have a massive terrorist attack in Oklahoma City, in which a truck bomb was driven up to a federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, and then you have 2 domestic terrorists detonating the truck bomb. This killed 168 people and wounded another 680. The 2 men responsible for this, one was put to death, executed, and the other is still alive, still in jail today. You also have another domestic terrorist attack in 1996 at the Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Georgia. You have a right-wing extremist planted a bomb in Centennial Park, which was kind of the center of the Olympic Games. And when this blew up, it killed 2 people and injured 111 people. You also have the first school shootings taking place in the late 90s in Pearl, Mississippi, and in Columbine, Colorado, a trend which tragically has not stopped to this day. And these tragedies showed that while the 20th century wars were over, the World Wars, the Cold War, Vietnam, all that stuff was over, we now have a new, less predictable threat of violence having replaced conventional warfare. Now, one infamous part about the Clinton presidency was his scandal and impeachment in 1998. So what happened is that a scandal was published that President Clinton had had a sexual relationship with a young intern in the White House. Now, Clinton denied the affair. He famously stated, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." And the woman also denied that the affair took place, as did First Lady Hillary Clinton. Now, after an investigation, it was proven that Clinton and his intern had indeed had sexual relations in the White House. President Clinton was then charged with perjury, which means lying under oath, when he said that he had not had an affair with her. And he was also charged with suborning perjury, which means telling someone else to lie under oath, which is what occurred with the intern. Now, Republicans in Congress saw an opportunity to remove Clinton from office, and so they began impeachment proceedings for the charges of perjury and suborning perjury. Clinton was found guilty by the House of Representatives and was impeached in 1998. But then the case went to the Senate, and after a 21-day trial, the Senate found Clinton not guilty and acquitted him, which allowed him to remain in office for the remaining 2 years of his term. Now, the Johnson and Trump impeachments, the only other two presidents so far to have been impeached, they ended in a similar fashion. So finally, 1999 was the year of the Y2K scare. Y2K stands for year 2000, and Y2K was essentially a panic throughout the country. We were afraid that on January 1st, 2000, all computers would malfunction, that computers that were invented in the 1900s would interpret the last two digits of the year, 00, not as 2000, but as 1900, and therefore all data would be lost. Some people even thought that the world would end. Now, thankfully, no serious problems resulted from the turn of the millennium, and things honestly looked quite bright in America and in the world going into the 21st century.